So I want to talk a little bit about proteins now, specifically what is hemoglobin, what are muscle fibers, what are specific conformations, what is protein denaturation, and how does diabetes affect a person's diet. So these are all big questions. We're going to talk a little bit about them, but I kind of want to talk about conformation first. And so we might be able to do the kind of an activity about this soon, but let me just open up another page on this. And so I think I did this in the previous video where I kind of drew a protein, a protein kind of like a squiggle, right? Like it folded, it twisted. It might have these weird structures to it. And really what I want you to understand is that this line, actually the line represents the NCC backbone. Okay? So on that backbone, we could have lots of offshoots though. We could have things popping up all along, and those lines represent the R groups, right? So the R groups or the residue groups. So you should look back at your notes to make sure you understand what these residue groups are. But let me just redraw the amino acid for you. So we've got NCC as our backbone. I'm going to use the same color coding that I have here. Off of what is that carbon, which I'm going to label as the alpha carbon, is something that's called a residue group or an R group. Off of that nitrogen, you could end up with two hydrogens, which is part of, of an amine or amino group. And off that carbon, you could end up with, you would have what's called, you might recognize this as a hydroxyl group, the OH, but when it's coupled with this carbon and double bonded oxygen, it's actually got another name called a carboxyl or a carboxylic acid group. Okay? And really the name amino acid comes from the amine and the acid here. So amino acid. And again, this yellow line represents just the NCC backbone, but it's really an NCC backbone when these NCCs combine. So remember, we've got an NCC, we've got an OH here, and then an H on the next amino acid. So we end up with an NCC. We get an OH and an H to leave, so then we end up with another NCC, an NCC, and this one's got two hydrogens on it still, but this nitrogen has lost one of its hydrogens to water, and this carbon has lost its OH group. So this still is the R, this is the double bonded oxygen, this has a hydrogen, sorry, remember carbon has 4 bonds, I forgot that hydrogen in there. That nitrogen only has one hydrogen connected to it. This has an R group. This is double oxygen. This is an H. And so it's this NCC backbone. This NCC backbone that's represented by that yellow line. And there are groups that come off of it. And those R groups have different properties, right? So these R groups could be acidic, they could be basic, they could be polar or have a charge, right? Charged, positive or negative, or they could be non-polar, right? Not have a charge. So not charged. And therefore not bond with water, right? So that all has, when we have all these R groups on this thing, it's going to change the shape because all these R groups are going to interact either with each other or bond with the water that they're in or hide from the water if they're hydrophobic. And so the three-dimensional shape of this protein, the three-dimensional shape is the conformation, right? It is the shape, not conformation, excuse me, the form, conformation. So it's the form in which this protein happens to be. And part of this is that maybe it's like right here. Let's say that this area, let me use a different color. Maybe it's this area right here that is going to bind with some other molecule. Well, if you have a bunch of hydrogens in the environment that are pulling on some of these R groups, that it might have a negative charge, if it's pulling, right, it's pulling it away, it's going to change the shape of the whole protein, and maybe this part's not going to work anymore, right? Or maybe temperature is going to do that. Remember, temperature is the amount of energy, and it's going to shake all the parts of this protein and all the R groups, and maybe the whole thing's going to bend, right? Like it's just going to fold or unfold, and it's going to change this thing here. And that's critically important, because when that happens, we use this word denatured, right? When it's denatured, it can't bind to the molecule it's supposed to bind with. And then therefore it doesn't do its job, okay? And really that's the conformation and denaturation. So denaturation is just changing the shape of the protein. So we'll talk about diabetes and the other ones now. So I'm going to go back to this one. So hemoglobin. So hemoglobin actually is it kind of tells you what it does in its name. So heme refers to iron, and globin refers to some kind of globular protein. So hemoglobin is in RBCs, or red blood cells. And that hemoglobin binds oxygen, binds O2 and CO2. So the O2 finds its way to your mitochondria for cellular respiration. And the CO2 removes waste from mitochondria produced in cellular respiration. Okay? And so hemoglobin is critically important, because if you did not get oxygen, you would not be able to make all the ATP, and if you do not get rid of CO2, then you would build up CO2 in your blood and go into toxic shock. You might have heard of another molecule called carbon monoxide. Carbon monoxide will kill you in high amounts. Carbon monoxide actually binds to the same place in hemoglobin that oxygen does, and therefore oxygen doesn't bind, and therefore you don't get oxygen to the mitochondria of really important cells like your brain cells or your heart cells, and that will cause you to die. Carbon monoxide would. And carbon monoxide is not something you smell, so that's why we often have carbon monoxide monitors in our homes, so that if it is present, we would know it before it would cause you harm. Muscle fibers are a different kind of protein, and the names of the proteins are actin, ACTIN, and myosin. And these are just two other kinds of fibers. So we've got globular and we've got fibril proteins that allow your, this is kind of like, it's called striated muscle. So you have smooth muscle and striated muscle. This is the muscle that you think of often in your arms and your legs, your abs, that kind of thing, that you can contract and relax to make your skeleton move. These are skeletal muscles. But you have non-skeletal muscles in your body that you can't consciously control. Like your stomach is constantly grinding, or it will be grinding against the food to increase its surface area. You can't control that. You have muscles in your esophagus and in your small intestines, that push food forward through your body, and that you can't control either. And that's called soft muscle. But actin and myosin are those muscle fibers. Okay. But I want to talk to you about diabetes because you asked. Okay. Because you asked. So diabetes. So let me make a little bit of a flow chart here, right? So diabetes. There are two types, right? There's type 1 and type 2. And type 1, let's say, okay, so type 1 is an autoimmune disease. I'm going to write that. I apologize for my handwriting, it's getting a little messy. Autoimmune disease. Basically, it's when somebody's body's attacking itself. It's a genetic condition in which you inherit these genes where your immune system attacks the pancreas. So it's not autoimmune, so it's really attacking the pancreas. And the pancreas has lots of roles, but one of them is to make a molecule, a protein called insulin. Now, insulin, I kind of think of as like a key that unlocks another doorway, right? So when there's insulin, it removes glucose from your blood. So if you have a high blood glucose level, insulin is released from the pancreas and it removes that glucose. But in type 1 diabetics, the pancreas has been attacked, so there's no insulin, and therefore glucose isn't removed from the blood. So someone might take an insulin injection, right? So when their blood sugar levels are high, they'll be able to reduce their blood sugar levels. Now, the reason blood sugar levels are so bad, high blood sugar levels, is because it can cause hypertension or high blood pressure, which can cause other conditions, right? So type 2 diabetes used to be called adult onset diabetes. No longer so because we see it more and more in kids. It's not an autoimmune disease, but the door, quote unquote door, that insulin unlocks no longer reads the insulin key. So you could keep giving lots and lots of insulin to type 2 diabetic, but that door, that protein that removes glucose from the blood, does not really read that insulin. And so the treatment is really to eat smaller and regular meals all throughout the day. Multiple meals, small meals, so as not to increase blood sugar levels too high. Okay? I hope that answers your questions, and I'm going to stop there.